Thank you, Madam Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, welcome guests. Labor Day, the theme of today's meeting, fits in perfectly with the clothing industry in Rochester. If you remember, 2 weeks ago we talked about how the shoe industry was Rochester's first big manufacturing sector. And we mentioned that by the 1890s, the clothing industry had overtaken the shoe industry in terms of employment, value added, output, things along those lines. Clothing industry started really in Rochester around 1812 when the first tailor arrived. And by the time we were a city, we had hundreds of small clothing companies, basically single proprietors who would sew out of the back of their house, would have a storefront on Main Street, on the Main Street Bridge. For anybody who might remember, and it's well before my time, Main Street Bridge was lined with buildings on both sides. And in the back rooms of these storefronts, they would sew to order. So you would come in, you'd get measured, they would cut the cloth there for you. Well, as time went on, they started doing more wholesale, so cutting standard sizes and shipping them. This is St. Paul Street between the inner loop and downtown. If any of you drive this road in the morning or in the afternoon, take a look at the buildings on the west side. Those were the second stage of the clothing industry. The first stage was on Mill Street, across from Frontier Field, a couple streets over by the river. They used water power to power the machines. When they got too big for those buildings, they moved over to St. Paul Street. Companies like Hickey-Freeman were located right in this area. Right? Hickey-Freeman is the last vestige of the great clothing industry we had. If you remember from last meeting speech, the Cox building was big into shoes. In fact, the Cox company made shoes. Well, after Cox left and moved to another building, who moved in? Clothing companies. They were filling all around St. Paul Street. I mean, up and down, there were dozens of clothing companies in these buildings. But again, they outgrew those buildings. They had, instead of 10 to 20 people making suits, they were getting into the hundreds. And so they were too big for St. Paul Street, so they moved to the rural sections of Rochester. Now, when I mean rural, I mean what is now outside the inner loop. And the first building built outside the inner loop for clothing was the Adler building. This is built on Hart Street. If you know where that is, it's down past the original Bausch and Lomb buildings. It's a little further out from the original Bausch and Lomb buildings. This was, they say, something like 90% glass, this building, to let in light, to make it easier for people to work. It opened in January of 1910, and it was hailed as one of the greatest buildings around. Also on St. Paul Street at the time, Adler was on St. Paul at Andrews. Across the street was the Lewis Holtz and Sons clothing company. Well, they outgrew their facility. They moved to Hudson Avenue. In 1919, they bought a 6-acre plot of land where they said they were going to build a modern manufacturing building surrounded by a park. Now, I think plans changed because this is right on Hudson Avenue. This is at 850 Hudson Avenue. But it stretches all the way back to North Street. It is now occupied by Quality Vision International. So if you've driven up Hudson Avenue or down Hudson Avenue and you see QVII, that was the Lewis Holtz and Sons company. In around 1920, 3 guys who each had their own clothing company decided, hey, let's get together. One of them manufactured just jackets, one of them manufactured just vests, and one of them manufactured just pants. So they said, hey, if we maybe merge, we could fill all the needs. So gentlemen, Keller, Hyman, and Thompson merged and formed, guess what? Keller, Hyman, and Thompson. Later on, it became Timely Clothes. This is, if you know where Silver Stadium used to be, if you go up Clinton Avenue towards the city, about a half a block, Red Wing Plaza, this is now Red Wing Plaza. This used to be Timely Clothes. And if you probably can't see it too well here, but there's about a 3-story building behind this facade that was part of the manufacturing center. And then on Sullivan Street, they had another. They had 5 buildings around Rochester. These 2 are still here. The other 3, I know at least 1 is gone. I know at least 2 are gone. I'm not sure where the 5th one is. It's hiding. And then again, if you drive up St. Paul Street in the morning, if you look off to the left, those buildings are on the right. If you look off to the left, you see the Michael Stearns Value First Clothes. Well, that's the Michael Stearns building. Started in 1849 by Henry Michaels, partnered with his son-in-law later on, formed Michael Stearns. They occupied this building, which was a massive building. They also had a building on Central Ave, a smaller building. They had a couple other buildings in other towns even, other outlying, Clyde and Penn Yan. They were midline clothing, midline suits, mid-level pricing. They survived until 1977. They were the oldest manufacturer of clothing at the time. And then, if you've ever been on Goodman Street, anybody know where Bausch & Lomb is? Well, Bausch & Lomb took over the building from General Dynamics, or Stromberg Carlson, who took it over from, guess what? Bonds Clothing. Bonds Clothing lasted until 1979. They built this building back in the 30s or 40s. It was the biggest clothing manufacturing in the world. Unfortunately, business started to go south, and I don't mean go bad, it means it actually went south. Lower labor costs and things like that. Bonds couldn't fill this building anymore, and they had to go back to their original building, which was behind Bausch & Lomb's headquarters on St. Paul Street. They actually were a lower line clothing. They had their own retail. They had the Bonds stores on Main and St. Paul, and they sewed just for themselves. They had their own. They controlled, the manufacturing, the warehousing, the retail, all together. And again, they lasted until about 1979 when they closed. And then finally, we're left with Hickey-Freeman. If you've been on Clinton Avenue, down around Avenue D or East, around there, Hickey-Freeman. They were, again, on St. Paul Street back in the early part of the 1900s, but they moved here around 1911, I believe. Why? Because this location was within walking distance of the majority of their workers. So they said, why not just build here? Which was, again, very rural for Rochester. There wasn't much out here. There were some houses, there were still some farms out here, so they were able to take this. In 1919, Levi brothers bought a plot of land next to them, and they were going to build a factory. It never happened. My guess is because in 22 they merged with Adler and formed Levi Brothers Adler Rochester, and located back in the Adler building. So the clothing industry, like the shoe industry, has a lot of buildings around Rochester. And if you drive around, take a look at some of the buildings, and let me know if you find some good, interesting ones. Let's see what industries were there. I focus mostly on the east side because that's where I am, and I can go up and down the bus lines on these streets and see these old buildings and say, hey, what businesses were there back in the 1900s or 1800s? So hopefully you'll take a little bit of pride in Rochester, at least the architecture, and if you need a suit, Hickey-Freeman's still manufacturing suits. The other suit manufacturer we have now, I don't think anyone can afford. That's Adrian Jewels. If you want a suit, it's a minimum of $5,000. So if you're a football player before the Super Bowl, usually Adrian Jules gets a plug because they're making the suits for them. And then the other clothing manufacturer that I'm aware of is Allison, which makes sporting goods or sporting apparel, and they're on the West Henrietta Road. But we used to have 10,000 workers in clothing. Now we're probably down to maybe 1,000. So again, you're driving around, take a look at some buildings, and there's a Toastmaster speech in each one of them. Madam Toastmaster.